You want to know why there's an entire chapter dedicated to treating human patients? Dr. Zixtal's anterior tentacles twitched in what his human colleagues had learned to recognize as barely contained amusement. Gather round, new residents. This is going to be educational. The assorted collection of alien medical residents, representing 6 different species from across the Galactic Medical Exchange Program, leaned forward in their various seats, appendages, and support structures. Their attention was fully captured by the veteran xenophysician who had spent the last 30 standard cycles treating humans at New Alexandria's Interspecies Medical Center. It started with what we thought was a simple case, Zixtal continued, his chromatophores shifting to a contemplative blue-green. Human male, mid-30s by their counting, brought in after what they call a minor workplace accident. One of the residents, a crystalline Pyraxian, chimed in with a harmonic tone of curiosity. Define minor, instructor? The patient had been impaled through the abdomen by a metal rod. A collective gasp rippled through the room, or rather a series of species-specific expressions of shock, ranging from rapidly fluctuating bioluminescence to concerned crystalline resonance. The truly remarkable part? Zixtal's skin flickered with barely suppressed mirth. He walked into the emergency department. Carrying a coffee. When we tried to take the beverage away, he informed us, and I quote, "Listen, Doc, I've already had a rough day. Don't make it worse by taking my coffee." The Arcturian resident's feather-like sensory filaments bristled. But the pain response alone should have... Ah! Zixtal's tentacles formed what his human co-workers called his teaching gesture. And there's your first lesson about humans. Their pain response is, well, complicated. You see, humans have this remarkable ability to simply ignore pain when they decide it's inconvenient. That's not physiologically possible, protested the Medusan resident, her neural tendrils writhing in confusion. Welcome to human medicine, where not physiologically possible is a phrase you'll need to remove from your vocabulary. Zixtal settled into his favorite teaching position, allowing his lower mass to spread comfortably across his support cushion. Let me tell you about the time a human construction worker came in with what we initially diagnosed as a fatal cranial trauma. The residents shifted uncomfortably. The human had been hit in the head with a falling beam. When we performed the initial scan, we found significant damage to the skull and underlying tissue. According to every medical text we had, except the human-specific ones, the patient should have been, at minimum, unconscious. Instead, he was arguing with the nurses about missing his lunch break. But the neural damage, the Pyraxian began. Oh, it was extensive. We showed him the scans, and you know what he said? Huh, that explains the headache. Can I get some aspirin? Zixtal's chromatophores rippled with remembered disbelief. That's when I learned about something humans call walking it off. The Arcturian sensory filaments drooped in confusion. Walking? What off? Apparently humans have decided that locomotion is some sort of universal cure-all. Broken bone? Walk it off. Concussion? Walk it off. Emotional trauma? Long walk on the beach. Zixtal's skin shifted to a shade that indicated professional bemusement. The truly fascinating part is that it sometimes works. Their bodies seem to respond to sheer stubborn determination in ways that defy conventional medical understanding. Surely that's an exaggeration, the Medusan resident ventured. I once had a human patient who sustained severe plasma burns across 40% of their body during a ship maintenance accident. When we began emergency treatment protocols, they insisted on attending a video conference first because, and I quote, "This quarterly report won't present itself." Zixtal's chromatophores flickered in a pattern that indicated both exasperation and admiration. We had to physically restrain them from attempting to conduct business from the burn unit. The residents exchanged glances, or their species equivalent of such. But that's not even the most remarkable aspect of human medical care, Zixtal continued. We need to discuss their healing process. Most species, when injured, enter a state of reduced activity to facilitate recovery. Humans, they become frustrated with the healing process and often attempt to accelerate it through sheer force of will. That's not how biology works, protested the Pyraxian. Tell that to the human who regrew nerve tissue because, and these are their exact words, being paralyzed is boring. Zixtal's skin rippled with remembered amazement. Their medical researchers are still trying to figure out how he did it, but their working theory involves something they call spite. The Arcturian sensory filaments twisted into what their species used as a question mark. Spite? A uniquely human emotional state that somehow converts irritation into medical miracles. I've seen humans recover from conditions that should have been terminal simply because they were annoyed at the inconvenience of dying. That's not possible, the Medusan insisted. I once had a human patient flatline for 6 minutes. When we finally restored cardiac function, their first words were, "Did I miss lunch?" Their second words were a complaint about the hospital's food quality. They then proceeded to demand their personal communication device so they could update their social media status about being briefly dead. The residents were now displaying various signs of distress, their species-specific expressions of disbelief reaching new heights. And then, Zixtal continued, his chromatophores shifting to what his human colleagues recognized as his "you won't believe this, but it's true" pattern. There's their response to what they call medications. Surely their pharmaceutical reactions follow standard biochemical principles, the Pyraxian offered hopefully. You would think so, wouldn't you? Zixtal's tentacles waved in what could only be described as resigned amusement. Let me tell you about human painkillers. Most species have a predictable response curve to analgesics. Humans? They either metabolize them so quickly they might as well be taking water, or they have reactions so dramatic we have to invent new warning labels. But that's impossible? Remember what I said about that word? Zixtal's skin flickered with mirth. I once had a human patient who metabolized our strongest painkillers as if they were mild stimulants. The next patient of the same approximate mass and genetic background went into what they called the best nap of my life after taking their equivalent of a mild headache remedy. The Medusan's neural tendrils were now tied in literal knots. How do we prescribe appropriate dosages? That's the neat part. You don't. You start with the manufacturer's recommended dose, then adjust based on the human's entirely subjective description of the effects, which will usually include at least one colorful metaphor and possibly a reference to their grandmother's cooking. Their grandmother's? The Arcturian's sensory filaments had completely tangled themselves. Oh yes, humans have this fascinating tendency to compare medical experiences to completely unrelated events. I once had a patient describe post-surgical pain as feeling like that time my cousin Eddie tried to deep fry a frozen turkey. Zixtal paused. I still don't know what that means, but the other humans in the room all nodded in understanding. But how do we treat conditions if their responses are so unpredictable? The Pyraxian asked, their crystalline structure vibrating with concern. Carefully, with extensive documentation, and a healthy appreciation for the fact that humans will routinely violate the laws of biochemistry because they don't have time to be sick right now. Zixtal's chromatophores shifted to a more serious tone. Which brings us to perhaps the most important lesson about treating human patients. Their psychological state has a direct and measurable impact on their physical recovery. The residents leaned forward, sensing a crucial piece of information. Humans have this remarkable ability to alter their physical condition through what they call positive thinking. Conversely, they can also convince themselves they're ill when no physical cause exists. We call this the human uncertainty principle. The mere act of a human observing their symptoms can change the symptoms themselves. That violates several fundamental principles of medical science, the Medusan pointed out. Welcome to human medicine. Zixtal's skin displayed a pattern that his human colleagues had dubbed the "here we go again" swirl. I once had a human recover from a severe bacterial infection faster than our most optimistic projections because, and I quote, "My daughter's wedding is next week, and I'm not missing it." But bacterial reproduction rates are constant, the Pyraxian protested. You would think so, wouldn't you? But somehow, this human's immune system apparently checked their social calendar and decided to work overtime. Zixtal's tentacles formed a gesture that indicated both pride and exasperation. We now have a working theory that human social obligations can temporarily boost their immune response by up to 47%. The residents were now showing various signs of medical distress themselves. And don't even get me started on their ability to selectively ignore symptoms based on their schedule. I've seen humans with broken bones insist on finishing their work shift because, and these are actual quotes, I already promised I'd cover for Dave. The deadline is tomorrow, and my personal favorite, it's just a little broken. Just a little broken? The Arcturian's sensory filaments had gone completely limp. Yes. Apparently humans have developed a sliding scale of injury severity that has nothing to do with actual medical criteria, and everything to do with how inconvenient they find the timing of their injury. Zixtal's chromatophores displayed what his human colleagues called his teaching moment pattern. Which brings us to the most important rule of treating human patients. Never, ever assume they're exaggerating their symptoms. The residents exchanged confused glances. You see, humans have this peculiar habit of understating severe medical conditions while simultaneously dramatizing minor ones. A human with a paper cut might declare they're dying, while a human with actual life-threatening injuries might insist they're just a bit under the weather. How do we determine the actual severity? The Medusan asked. That's the real art of human medicine. You have to learn to read between the lines. If a human says, "I'm fine, Fadet," that could mean anything from, "I am genuinely unharmed," to, "I am currently experiencing multiple organ failure but have a meeting in 10 minutes. Conversely, if they say they're dying, they probably just have a mild viral infection. This makes no logical sense, the Pyraxian observed. Exactly. Now you're beginning to understand. Zixtal's skin displayed a pattern of approval. Human medicine isn't just about understanding their bizarre physiology. It's about understanding their even more bizarre psychology. Is there any way to predict their responses? The Arcturian asked hopefully. Oh yes. They're completely unpredictable, but they're unpredictable in predictable ways. Zixtal's tentacles formed what his human colleagues called his punchline gesture. For instance, you can always count on a human to attempt to leave the medical facility approximately 47% sooner than medically advised. But why? The Medusan's neural tendrils writhed in confusion. Because they have stuff to do. Zixtal's chromatophores rippled with what could only be described as fond exasperation. Humans have developed this remarkable ability to prioritize their daily obligations over potentially fatal medical conditions. I once had a patient attempt to leave mid-surgery because, and I quote, "I forgot to feed my cat." The residents were now displaying various signs of mental shutdown, but perhaps the most fascinating aspect of human medical care is their concept of walking it off, combined with something they call sleeping it off. Zixtal's skin shifted to what his human colleagues recognized as his storytelling pattern. Humans appear to believe that any medical condition can be resolved by either continuing to move or becoming temporarily unconscious. That's not how healing works, the Pyraxian protested. Tell that to the human who recovered from a Class 3 neural disruption because they took a nap. Zixtal's tentacles waved in a gesture of surrender to the absurdity. We still haven't figured out how they did it. Their explanation was, and I quote, "I just felt really tired, so I slept for like 14 hours, and now I feel great." The residents were now showing signs of what human medical texts would describe as an existential crisis. And that, young residents, is why human medical care has its own chapter. Because just when you think you understand how their bodies work, they'll do something that makes you question everything you know about medical science. Zixtal's chromatophores settled into a pattern of sage wisdom. Remember, when treating humans, the phrase, "that's impossible," is less a medical opinion and more of a challenge they'll take personally. The room was silent for a moment before the Arcturian raised an appendage. Instructor, how do you cope with the stress of treating such unpredictable patients? Zixtal's skin displayed what his human colleagues had dubbed his ironically amused pattern. I've learned to do what humans do. I take it one day at a time, keep detailed records of their impossible recoveries, and occasionally need a strong drink. Is that medically advised? The Medusan asked cautiously. According to human medical literature, it's called stress management. Zixtal's chromatophores flickered with humor, though I should note that humans also consider running until exhaustion and screaming into the void as equally valid stress management techniques. The residents were now displaying various species-specific expressions of having their entire medical worldview systematically dismantled. Welcome to human medicine, Zixtal concluded, his skin displaying a pattern that somehow managed to convey both professional pride and cosmic irony. Where the rules are made up, the humans don't care about physiological limitations, and somehow, against all logic and reason, it works. As the residents filed out of the teaching chamber, each clutching their medical tablets and re-evaluating their career choices, Zixtal's communication device chimed. He checked the message, and his chromatophores rippled with what could only be described as resigned amusement. The message read, "Patient in Emergency Pod 7 insisting they're totally fine despite major traumatic injury. Claims they can't be admitted because, quote, the dog gets anxious if I'm not home for dinner. Requesting senior consultant intervention." Zixtal's skin displayed his species' equivalent of a smile as he headed toward Emergency Pod 7. Just another typical day in human medicine. As he moved through the corridor, he couldn't help but reflect that perhaps the most remarkable thing about humans wasn't their impossible recoveries or their ability to ignore life-threatening injuries. It was their absolute conviction that the laws of biology were more like guidelines, really, and that they could negotiate with their own mortality as if it were an overly demanding supervisor. And somehow, against all medical logic and biological reason, they were often right. Today, Dr. Zixtal announced to his increasingly nervous residents, "We begin your practical training with human patients." The collective anxiety in the room manifested in various species-specific ways. The Paraxian's crystalline structure emitted a high-pitched hum, the Medusan's neural tendrils tied themselves into complex geometric shapes, and the Arcturian's sensory filaments had turned an interesting shade of worried purple. "But instructor," the Paraxian chimed nervously, "we haven't finished reviewing all the theoretical impossibilities humans regularly perform." "Ah, but that's the beauty of it." Zixtal's chromatophores flickered with what his human colleagues called his mischievous professor pattern. No amount of theoretical study can prepare you for actual human patients. Sometimes, you just have to jump into the quantum uncertainty field, as humans would say. Just then, his communication device chimed with an alert from the emergency department. His skin rippled with what could only be described as professional delight. "Perfect timing. We have our first case. Emergency Pod 3 has a human patient who—" He paused, his tentacles twisting in what might have been disbelief. "Apparently superglued their hands together while attempting to repair something called a smartphone at 3 in the morning. Super-glued? The Arcturian's sensory filaments twisted into a question mark. An adhesive humans invented that forms nearly instantaneous molecular bonds. They use it for everything from household repairs to, apparently, ill-advised late-night technology maintenance." Zixtal gestured for his residents to follow. "Come along. This will be educational." They found their patient sitting calmly in Emergency Pod 3, hands firmly bonded together, smartphone parts scattered across the examination table. The human, a young male with what Zixtal had learned to recognize as the distinct expression of someone who had just realized their brilliant idea wasn't so brilliant after all, looked up and grinned sheepishly. "So," the human began. "Funny story." "Let me guess." Zixtal's chromatophores shifted to his "I've seen this before" pattern. "You decided to repair your own device despite having no technical training because how hard could it be?" "Well, when you put it like that, it sounds irresponsible," the human replied. "I prefer to think of it as optimistic problem-solving." The residents were furiously taking notes on their tablets, or in the case of the Medusan, directly absorbing the information through her neural tendrils. "And the reason you attempted this at 3 in the morning was—" Zixtal prompted. "I couldn't sleep because my phone was broken, so obviously that was the perfect time to fix it." The human's tone suggested this was the most logical conclusion possible. The Pyraxian's crystalline structure vibrated with confusion. "But, without proper rest cycles, decision-making capabilities are impaired." "Oh, absolutely," the human agreed cheerfully. "But that's when I get all my best ideas. Like last week, I decided to reorganize my entire apartment at 2 a.m. Did you know you can fit an entire couch through a window? Well, technically most of a couch." Zixtal turned to his residents. "Note this down. Humans often engage in complex problem-solving activities during their designated rest periods, with results that frequently lead to emergency department visits." "But why?" The Arcturian's sensory filaments had tied themselves into what appeared to be a DNA double helix of confusion. "Because sleep is for the weak," the human supplied helpfully. "Also, I had coffee." "Ah, yes." Zixtal's skin displayed his "here we go again" pattern. The human stimulant beverage that somehow simultaneously helps them function and impairs their judgment. Make note of this, residents. A human claiming they've had coffee can explain a remarkable variety of emergency department presentations. As one of the medical technicians worked on safely dissolving the adhesive bonds, the human continued chatting amiably about their misadventure. "You know, I almost didn't come in. I figured I could probably just wait for it to wear off naturally. The molecular bonds would have taken approximately 47 standard cycles to degrade naturally," the Paraxian pointed out. "Yeah, but I have a meeting at 9, so I figured I had about 5 hours to solve this on my own first." Zixtal's chromatophores flickered with resigned amusement. "Residents, observe another classic example of human priorities. Professional obligations consistently outweigh serious medical concerns." "It's not that serious," the human protested as the technician finally freed their hands. See? Good as new. Though I should probably head home and finish fixing my phone. You will do no such thing. Zixtal's tentacles formed what his human colleagues called his stern doctor gesture. You need rest and should avoid any adhesives for at least 24 hours. But what if I promise to wear gloves this time? The residents watched in fascination as their instructor's skin displayed a complex pattern that somehow conveyed both professional authority and the distinct knowledge that this human would probably be back within the week for a similar incident. Residents! Zixtal announced as the human finally left, after 3 more attempts to negotiate permission to just try one more quick fix. What have we learned? Humans attempt complex tasks during inappropriate time periods. The Medusan ventured. Their decision-making processes defy conventional logic, added the Arcturian. They consider temporary molecular bonding of appendages a minor inconvenience, the Paraxian chimed in. All excellent observations. Zixtal's chromatophores shifted to his teaching pattern. But perhaps the most important lesson is... His communication device chimed again. His skin rippled with what might have been amusement as he read the message. Ah, perfect. A practical demonstration of our next lesson. It seems we have another human in Emergency Pod 8 who, and I quote, barely broke anything while attempting to recreate something called a parkour video they watched online. Barely broke? The Arcturian's sensory filaments had gone completely limp. Yes, apparently humans have developed a sliding scale of skeletal integrity that bears no relation to actual medical science. Zixtal gestured for his residents to follow. Come along. This is an excellent opportunity to observe the human phenomenon of it's just a scratch in relation to multiple fractures. As they moved toward Emergency Pod 8, the Medusan raised a neural tendril. Instructor, how do humans survive as a species with such unique approaches to self-preservation? That, young resident, is the question that has puzzled xenophysicians since we first encountered them. Zixtal's skin displayed what his human colleagues called his philosophical reflection pattern. The leading theory is that they survive not in spite of these traits, but because of them. Their ability to ignore limitations, push through impossible situations, and treat serious medical conditions as minor inconveniences somehow combines into a remarkably effective survival strategy. They reached Emergency Pod 8 to find a human sitting on the examination table, covered in what appeared to be a creative mixture of mud, leaves, and minor abrasions, with one leg bent at an angle that suggested a passing acquaintance with proper skeletal arrangement. You should see the other guy, the human announced proudly. The other guy was a tree, came the dry response from the attending nurse. Yeah, but I almost made it over it before gravity remembered it was supposed to be working. Zixtal turned to his residents, his chromatophores displaying what could only be described as professional resignation mixed with amused acceptance. Welcome to your first lesson in practical human medicine. Remember, what doesn't kill them makes them try it again, usually with a camera recording this time. The residents exchanged glances, each wondering if perhaps they should have specialized in a less challenging field, like quantum surgery or temporal medicine. But as they watched their instructor calmly deal with a human who was simultaneously insisting they were totally fine, while sporting injuries that would have incapacitated most species, they began to understand why human medicine had its own chapter. It wasn't just because humans defied medical science on a regular basis. It was because they did so with such cheerful determination that even the laws of biology had learned to simply sigh and make an exception. As if to prove this point, the human in Emergency Pod 8 was now enthusiastically explaining their theory about how they could definitely improve their technique for the next attempt, while Zixtal's chromatophores displayed a pattern that his human colleagues had recently dubbed, "Here we go again," but with more paperwork this time. Just another day in human medicine, where the impossible was routine. The routine was never simple, and somehow, against all logic and reason, it all worked out in the end, usually with an interesting story to tell at the next staff meeting. Tonight, Dr. Zixtal announced to his increasingly experienced but still thoroughly bewildered residents, we're doing something special. You'll be observing the emergency department during what humans call the graveyard shift. Is this shift performed in actual graveyards? The Arcturian asked nervously, sensory filaments quivering. No, though given some of the patients we receive during these hours, you'd be forgiven for thinking so. Zixtal's chromatophores shifted to what his human colleagues called his night shift blues pattern. The term refers to the late-night hours when humans are theoretically supposed to be sleeping, but instead find remarkably creative ways to require medical attention. Right on cue, his communication device chimed with the first alert of the night. Ah, perfect timing. Emergency Pod 4 has a human who... He paused, his tentacles twisting in what might have been disbelief. Attempted to demonstrate that they could, quote, definitely fit through that gap, while escaping from something called a haunted escape room experience. What's a haunted escape room? The Medusan inquired, neural tendrils curling with curiosity. As far as I understand it, humans voluntarily pay money to be locked in a room they must escape from, while other humans pretend to be supernatural entities intent on causing them harm. Zixtal's skin rippled with what could only be described as resigned amusement, because apparently their daily lives aren't exciting enough. They found their patient wedged at an impressive angle between two partially demolished wall panels, sporting what appeared to be novelty vampire fangs, and covered in what the attending nurse assured them was artificial blood. In my defense, the human began, the zombie was very convincing. There was no zombie, the escape room employee who had accompanied them to the hospital clarified. It was a recorded growling sound and some fog effects. Well, it worked. Also, has anyone seen my phone? I really need to post about this on social media. Zixtal turned to his residents. Note this down. Humans will frequently prioritize documenting their mishaps over receiving treatment for said mishaps. As they worked to carefully extract the patient, another alert came through. Zixtal's chromatophores displayed what his colleagues recognized as his double trouble pattern. Emergency Pod 2 has a human with... Ah, yes, another classic night shift presentation. They attempted to cook something called instant noodles without the traditionally required water component. But wouldn't that result in... The Paraxian began. A small kitchen fire? Yes. Did they attempt to extinguish said fire with an inappropriate substance? Also yes. Are they now covered in a mixture of burned noodles and the contents of what they thought was a water pitcher but was actually their roommate's protein shake? Surprisingly, yes. The residents dutifully followed their instructor to Emergency Pod 2, where they found a human who smelled strongly of burned artificial chicken flavoring and whey protein. I was hungry, the human explained, as if this justified everything that had followed, and I didn't want to wake my roommate by turning on the lights. So you attempted to cook in complete darkness? The Medusan's neural tendrils twisted in confusion. I used my phone's flashlight, the human protested, until I dropped it in the protein shake. Speaking of which, do you know if rice actually works for drying out phones? Because I've got it in a bowl of rice right now, but I'm thinking maybe quinoa would work better. It's more expensive, so it should be more effective, right? Zixtal's chromatophores shifted to what his human colleagues had recently termed his give me strength pattern. Residents, observe how humans often attempt to apply logic to situations, long after it would have been useful. The night continued in a similar vein. They treated a human who had attempted to recreate a viral dance challenge on their apartment's rain-slicked balcony. The lighting was perfect. Another who had tried to determine if their refrigerator's light really went off when the door closed by removing the door entirely, for science. And a group of 3 who had collectively decided that 3 a.m. was the perfect time to test if their new trampoline could support the weight of 3 adults and a watermelon. The watermelon was fine, by the way. Instructor, the Arcturian ventured during a brief lull. I'm noticing a pattern with the timing of these incidents. Ah, yes. Zixtal's skin displayed his teaching moment pattern. Humans appear to experience a significant decline in both judgment and self-preservation instincts during their standard sleep cycle hours. We call this the nocturnal brilliance phenomenon. Because they become more intelligent at night? The Paraxian asked hopefully. Because they become convinced they're more intelligent at night, Zixtal clarified. There's a direct inverse relationship between the hour of the night and the wisdom of their decisions. His device chimed again. Speaking of which, Emergency Pod 6 has a human who decided to... He paused, his tentacles forming what might have been an expression of profound confusion. Test if they were allergic to their friend's pet bee. Pet bee? The Medusan's neural tendrils tied themselves into knots. Apparently, it's an emotional support bee, Zixtal read from the report. The patient's exact words were, "It looked so friendly." They arrived at Emergency Pod 6 to find a human whose face had achieved impressive proportions, yet who was still attempting to explain the rationality of their actions. Look, the human said, voice slightly muffled by swelling. How else was I supposed to know if I was allergic? Perhaps by consulting a medical professional during regular business hours, Zixtal suggested. That would have taken forever. This way, I got immediate results. Indeed. Zixtal turned to his residents. Note this down. Humans often prefer immediate, potentially catastrophic results over slower, safer methods of obtaining information. As they administered treatment, another alert came through. Zixtal's chromatophores displayed what could only be described as professional resignation tinged with morbid curiosity. Emergency Pod 1 has a human who... He paused, his tentacles performing what his colleagues called a double take. Attempted to prove that hot sauce could be used as an alternative energy drink. But wouldn't that cause significant gastrointestinal distress? The Pyraxian asked. Oh, absolutely, Zixtal confirmed. But apparently, they had an important deadline approaching and, quote, coffee wasn't cutting it anymore. They found their patient alternating between expressions of profound regret and fierce pride. I stayed awake, didn't I? They declared between sips of milk. Technically, it worked. Technically, you're experiencing what could be classified as a medical emergency, Zixtal pointed out. Yeah, but I finished my project first. Priorities, Doc. Zixtal turned to his increasingly shell-shocked residents, and there you have another key principle of human medicine. Success and survival are not necessarily the same thing in human calculations. As the night shift wore on, they encountered more examples of what Zixtal termed humanity's unique approach to problem-solving. There was the human who had attempted to use their bathtub as a temporary aquarium. The pet store was closed and the fish looked lonely. Another who had tried to determine if they could develop night vision by sitting in complete darkness for 6 hours. I think I was starting to see something before I walked into the wall. And a group who had decided to hold an impromptu cooking competition using only ingredients that started with the letter Q. Did you know quinoa is flammable under the right conditions? As their shift neared its end, the Medusan raised a neural tendril. Instructor, how do you maintain professional composure when faced with such unique situations? The secret, young resident, is to remember that while humans may seem to lack common sense, they make up for it with an abundance of determination, creativity, and what they call impressive commitment to the bit. Zixtal's chromatophores shifted to his wisdom of experience pattern. Also, I've learned to keep a journal. The medical board is particularly interested in documenting these cases for future research. His device chimed one final time. Ah, a perfect case to end our shift. Emergency Pod 5 has a human who... Oh my. His tentacles twisted in what might have been admiration. They attempted to prove that they could successfully complete their morning exercise routine at 4 a.m. while standing on their head because, and I quote, vertical push-ups seemed too mainstream. As they headed toward their final case of the night, the Arcturian's sensory filaments had taken on what could only be described as a resigned droop. Instructor, will we ever truly understand human decision-making processes? My dear resident, Zixtal's skin displayed what his human colleagues called his night shift wisdom pattern. Understanding isn't necessary. Acceptance is key. Remember, humans don't need their actions to make sense. They just need them to make for a good story later. And as they treated their final patient, who was still attempting to demonstrate their inverted exercise technique despite being actively connected to medical monitoring equipment, Zixtal couldn't help but reflect that perhaps this was why humans had achieved so much as a species. After all, any species that could look at the laws of physics, biology, and common sense as mere suggestions was bound to either achieve the impossible or end up in the emergency department trying. Usually both.